Welcome, welcome. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen.
Amen.
So we have this unusual halacha, that was related to this story about, Ham and Shem and Japhet, and how Ham went in and saw Noah exposed and reported it back to his brothers, and Shem and Japhet went in, and they did not see. They took a sheet and they covered up Noah, and they made sure they did not look at his nakedness. Okay, and I'll go over this again, but then we hopefully will have time now for this, for the Torah T'mimah. So ve'ervat avihem, and the nakedness of their father, etc. Right? They didn't see. Amar Rav Yehuda, said Rav Yehuda, Oved Kochavim Arum, if you are in the presence of literally it means an idol worshiper who is naked, Asur likrot kriyat Shema kenegdo. One is forbidden to recite the recitation of the Shema, right? The Shema Yisrael, opposite him. In other words, in his presence. And that is because when you say the Shema Yisrael, you're bearing testimony to your belief in God as a Jewish person. And it's a very holy moment. And there's the idea, we'll see more about it. Torah T'mimah explains some of the thoughts behind it based on scriptural verses as to why this would not be appropriate, right? So, Sal Kada Tachamina, because it might occur to you, Kevan, that since Dichtiv Baho regarding idolaters, it states in Ezekiel chapter 23, Asher Besar Chamorim Besaram, because the flesh of donkeys is their flesh, right? Ema Kachamor Ba'amahu. You could say, well, it's just like a donkey, right? The animals don't wear clothes, right there. And you can certainly say the Shema in the presence of an animal, right? Not a problem. And because it makes that statement, you come up with that reasoning. Kamash malan, and for that reason, Scripture teaches the inhu nami ikru erva, that regarding to them, that is to idolaters, they're also referred to, if they're naked, they're also considered um, exposed, right? The nakedness. There's a concept of nakedness with regards to them as well, to the idolaters. Dichtiv, as it says, ve'ervat avihem, it states explicitly the nakedness of their father. Lo ra'u, they did not see. They did not see. And this is Noah. Noah is not an Israelite. He's not a Ben Yisrael. He represents the rest of basically the entire human population. Okay. And here we go. Hatam bazeh, right? And what is the reason behind all of this? Mishum dichtiv, because it says in Parshat Ki Teitzei, this is in the book of Deuteronomy, it says, Velo yir'eh becha arvat ervat davar. It makes a statement there. I believe that it is a passage that speaks about making sure that I think it has to do with making sure that you have a latrine, that when you go to the bathroom, you cover it up, etc., etc. And I think that's the context of that particular statement, that there should not be this kind of exposure regarding in your camp, that there's holiness, and because you're in a situation of holiness, you should not have this idea of nakedness. Vayitba'er im yirtzeh Hashem, and as will be explained, God willing, in Yanzeh, this whole issue, lefanenu, coming up, Sham, there in Parshat Ki Teitzei, in the book of Deuteronomy, that's where he's going to go into this in more detail, because there it's in its context. Uchlal ha'inyan, right? And as to in general, this whole subject, v'hatzrichuta, right? And the need for it, Yipale. It's I think this is a yud. It could be ufela, right? Is perplexing. Vedorshim biur shel tam. And it requires an explanation of this whole thing, right? So he is troubled. He is raising up this whole issue because it's uncomfortable talking about human beings, right? As you know, and that one might think that you have to look at them as animals, not something that's really comfortable, right? It's very perplexing. This whole little passage that we're talking about. Understood that that you want to be in a pure sort of place when you're saying the Shema, but then talking about human beings, right? In this way, even idolaters, if you want to, but very often they use the term idolaters to just mean non-Jews, people who are not Jewish. So it's he's getting into that. He's saying it's the whole idea that you might have to think this, right? It's just weird, right? Vayitachen lomar. And one could say, de'ire, that this is really talking, it's a limited application. It's not really talking about every single other idolater, but it is talking about a specific class, be'ela ha'umot ha'pra'im. He's talking about people who are wild, human beings that act in a wild kind of situation. They're uncivilized. Hadarim bein hare Africa, for example, they live in the mountains of Africa, he says, ve'od b'mokomot, and other places she'einan miyushavim, that are not inhabited. They live in basically uninhabited areas, kara'ui, as is and as it seems, shedarcham lelech arumim, that it's their habit to actually they go about naked. They don't wear any clothing. And so they are exposed, and that's who they're talking about here. That he wants to try and say that there is a reasonable context, and it's limited. This particular halacha is not talking about every single that one would think that about every single idolater, but rather that it's talking about people who actually walk about and are exposed. Kemuva, and as this is brought up, B'sifrei Yediot Ha'olam, he's talking about there are books that describe people around the world, possibly geography he's talking about, but he's talking about, these are scientific books that discuss various peoples, and he says, he's seen in books that there are certain tribal peoples that essentially walk around naked. Vahava Amina, and I might have said, Kevan shedercham bechach, that since they act in this particular way, not to clothe themselves at all, harehem kevehemot v'chayot, and in that case, that's why they can be considered like cattle and wild animals, right? Asher mikevan sherigelim lelech because since animals go simply the way they're created, animals don't wear clothing, right? So there's the comparison. These human beings don't wear clothing, animals don't wear clothing, right? So ein chashuvim isurei erva. That regarding the prohibitions of exposure, of human exposure, doesn't apply to them. So you can see how he is trying to, I think, put a reasonable explanation that doesn't come out so insulting as that initial statement that we just read. But he's trying to put some level of reality and application of this particular halacha. Right. Kamash malan. And since they don't wear clothing, animals don't wear clothing, we might compare them to animals and say, it's okay. Their nature of exposure is, at least from a halachic point of view, not objectionable. Kamash malan, and for this reason, the kevan de achol panim hemin enoshi, that at the same time, right? They're still a species of human beings. They're still human beings. Harei heim kechol adam l'inyan zeh. They can be compared to any other human being when it comes to this matter. Umevi l'samech ra'aya, and he brings to support as his proof pasuk shelefanenu, from the verse that is in front of us, the one about Noah's sons. The afal pi shebnei Noach hitnahagu b'chama imyaniyot, that despite the fact that idolaters sometimes behave, right, they in various ways, minhagim behemiyim, they act like animals. Sometimes they just follow their animal instincts. B'chol zeh, nevertheless, hishtadlu leharchik ra'itam mimagnut avihem. That they, that is in this case the sons of Noah, still, right? They still did their best to restrict, to distance their vision from the shame of their father, from humiliating their father. They didn't want to do that. Hare, and for this reason, the chashiva zot lecherpa slimin adam. So clearly, right, viewing someone's exposed genitals, etc., is still just simply from a human perspective, it is something to be reviled. You want to avoid it. Good. So that's point number one. So now we go on to another halachic point. Veda, and no, the ita bechulin, that it states in the tractate Chulin. Yes, before I go on, go ahead, David.
Yeah. So what I'm trying to understand out of all that, okay. So did we get to the point where basically, where part of it was not being able to say the Shema, and extending that, to idolaters, right? And because So did we get to the point of saying, okay, it is okay or not okay, or we're still not there yet?
No,
That's
we are saying that, right, and not just, it's not just idolaters, it's naked
right.
idolaters.
Naked
That's what we're
idolaters,
talking
but there was
about.
right.
If it's a non-Jew who's naked, we still shouldn't recite the Shema in that moment. That the idea of giving them that idea. We know, if I can, okay, there are people who dehumanize other types, other civilizations of human beings. They consider them less than human beings. And this is saying the way Torah T'mimah is explaining is, in the final analysis, they are human beings. And if they're in a state of exposure, right, which is something, it's something we should avoid. You don't say the Shema.
Okay, but we're also not calling idolaters donkeys anymore, right? I mean, or
No,
that.
I don't think so. I mean,
I,
you have this verse in Ezekiel, okay? And we have to allow for the fact that in a literary situation, there's exaggeration, okay? And Ezekiel, again, we'd have to go back and look at the actual chapter, but he might be talking about some really awful kinds of things that these people are doing. And so he's using this hyperbole to describe them that way.
right, because the whole argument we were just listening, or you were just describing, was basically to try to look at people in some level, some areas of the world that might actually behave like animals just because of the nature of what of how, because they're so remote from civilization, right?
Right.
That's what I got out of that,
That
which
is
is
correct. Yes.
and basically that was to kind of enable the comparison to the donkeys,
Ex-
right? Or limit
Exactly.
it. Pardon me?
Wait,
Yes,
wait. I have a
you're
question.
right. You're right.
Okay,
I
thanks.
have
I'm starting to get it.
Yes, that's the reason. Yes.
question.
That's the way he is fine, dealing with something that is difficult. Yes, go ahead.
Omi,
Yeah.
donkey a work animal? Or no, is too stubborn to be a work animal?
No, a donkey is a very useful work animal. If you go to the Middle East, you'll see very often they use donkeys as work animals for sure.
That's how I would make the comparison to adulterers.
Okay, idolatrous in what sense?
Well, he was comparing adulterers to donkeys, so that means that if someone's being an idolater, they are a potential, slave or employee.
I think that's reaching. Honest. I have to respectfully disagree.
Because they're wasting
Okay.
time.
I think, okay. Again, I think because certainly Jews worked as well. They all did. And we actually read about, Hebrew indentured servants in the Torah, etc. I really think it has more to do the whole notion of what it is to be human. Mike, I think you are raising a really good issue in terms of exploring this, and in trying to understand, what exactly is going on. I think that you you know the question becomes, what is it to act like a human being? If you act and just simply follow your instincts, are you truly fulfilling your role as a human being? Or is an essential part of being a human being as opposed to simply being an animal? Because after all, we are animals too. And so what is the distinction between ourselves and the rest of the animal world? Okay. And it has a lot to do with our ability to control our instincts and our desires. It has a lot to do with this. And also to have a sense of shame. That having a sense of shame is an important thing. And these people have no sense of shame. That is the people he's referring to who walk around naked and exposed. If you want to react, I'm certainly open to your, reacting to that. But I believe that's really where he's coming from.
But
Okay.
that's how I see idolatry all the time, is that these are people who waste time. So
Well, I'm not saying that you're wrong. I'm not saying you're wrong. Yeah. There are lots of ways in which one can waste time, that's for sure. Not I mean, idolatry essentially is replacing the divine creator with some other form of, considering that to be the most important thing. Right. So so in a sense, of course, worshiping money. And again, you get into what does it mean to worship, etc. I don't want to take the time now to necessarily analyze that, but that I think is essentially what we're talking about when we're talking
missing the
about idolatry.
so be led.
Say that again, please. Go ahead.
They're missing the point, so they need to be led. That's the whole concept of the master-slave relationship.
Okay, I'll let it stand. Let's keep going. Okay. V'da, and know, the ita b'chulin, that in the tractate Chulin, page 10b, the yitzi'ah derech achorav. The other thing that we were reading about here is that Shem and Yefet went in backwards. They did not go forward, because had they walked in forward, they would have seen their father being exposed. And so they intentionally walked backwards into his presence. And there's this discussion about walking backwards in Tractate Chulin that says that when you leave a place backwards, lo shma yetziah, you cannot really talk about that being an exit. That's not exit in a technical sense. Iyan and if you check it out in Chulin, right? Bameh shenogea ledina, in what sense this has applications in terms of Jewish law. Because Jewish law deals with every detail, pretty much every single detail of human behavior, and there may be things where retreating, walking backwards is an important thing. And so, for example, leaving the presence, if you want to leave the presence of the divine, how do you do that? How do you, in a respectful way, as opposed to sort of more intense moments like when you're saying the Amidah, the silent devotion, you're supposed to see yourself as coming into the divine presence. And you may have seen times when one takes 3 steps backwards, right? Etc. Okay. So I suspect this is what we're talking about here. That there are situations where how you depart is important, and it's an important issue. So, but he's going into a different issue here, interestingly enough. He says, well, it would then appear that one has to look more deeply into this. Dahacha, because here, mashma, it implies, the halicha achoranit nikret halicha, because we could say that when you walk backwards, that is walking. That's talking about the way Shem and Yefet went into Noah's presence. They were walking backwards, and yet walking backwards here is understood as still, nevertheless, walking. Ki dichtiv, as it says, b'pasuk zeh, it says in this verse, vayelchu achoranit. They walked backwards. They're walking backwards. V'im kain, and if that's the case, gam yitzia kazot tzricha liot shma yitzia. And so we were saying, leaving walking backwards isn't actually exiting, but if you walk backwards in, and that's considered walking, then retreating, walking backwards is also walking. It's still walking, right? Okay. So it's normal. It's the normal may be the wrong way to describe this, but it's considered walking. V'yesh lomar, and one might say, al pi hamavu'ar b'Gemara, with reference to what's explained in the Gemara, in the Talmud Sham, there, in that place, deha kohen gadol b'Yom HaKippurim, that the high priest on the Day of Atonement, on Yom Kippur, haya yotze uva derech knisato. When he entered into the Holy of Holies, he was facing the ark, and when he left the Holy of Holies, he left facing the ark. In other words, he was walking backwards. That was the Kohen Gadol. Amru b'Gemara, and there in the Talmud, in the Gemara, they say, the Yitziah kazo nikret Yitziah, that with regard to that walking out, that exiting, in this situation, it's still considered leaving, still considered going out. Mishum, why? Why in this case? Shehalach kain lichvod hamakom. Because the reason the high priest didn't turn around to leave the Holy of Holies, but left facing the ark, walking backwards, was out of respect for the divine. Ke talmid haniftar mirabo. Just as a student who is departing from his master, from his teacher, doesn't turn his back on him. And likewise, had the high priest turned around to leave the Holy of Holies, he would have wound up turning his back on the divine throne, that is the ark, and so that's why he left walking backwards. And that is still considered walking, etc. The imkain, and if this is the case, hachinami b'Shem v'Yefet, we could apply the same principle to Shem and Yefet, shehalchu kain, that they walked in this way, b'mechuvan lichvod avihem, with the express intention of showing honor to their father, shelo yir'u bignuto, and so that they wouldn't observe, they wouldn't see his humiliation. Nikret halicha zo halicha. And in this case, you could say that they're walking like that, even though they were walking backwards. It is still halicha. It's still walking. Mishum, and for the reason that latachlit zo, that if it's done for this purpose, heve dacho b'chach, right? It is a appropriate way to do things. Ve'ein ra'aya l'da alma, and for that reason, it's not a proof. That is, the fact that they walked backwards is not a proof that, in this case, that walking backwards is always not walking. It's not considered proper walking. That's the idea. So, any comments on this? Nope. Okay. Let's see.
Rabbi,
Yes, Harlan.
at the shul, a lot of people that have to go to the bathroom or something while the Torah is out, they
Yeah.
walk backwards.
Okay. Yes. In other words, what you're saying is they take like a few steps backwards before they turn around.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's the basis of this. Right. So, yeah. Yeah. So it could be that the real issue going on here is that leaving someone sometimes can appear to be, you know, uh, not respectful, but that when you do it in this way, it's not departing from them. So that could be the context in which we're talking about here. That taking a few steps backwards, generally it's 3 steps backwards, so that it's not departing, in possibly a rude way. So, okay. It's interesting. I mean, it doesn't quite sound like the point he's making here, but it could be that they're really speaking in a different sense. And because I'm not fully familiar with this particular topic, I'm also trying to understand what he's saying here. Because he doesn't explain the context in which walking backwards isn't considered walking. So, all right. We'll let it go for this today. And I'll stop the share. Okay. All right. Very good. And God willing, no class tomorrow or Tuesday because of Shavuot. So please God, I will see you on Wednesday morning on Zoom.